Welcome to our Chatting with NDGS Paleo talk today. We have a guest speaker, a guest lecturer from NDSU over in Fargo. Her name is Dr. Lydia Tackett, and she will be talking about Teredo, which happens to be our state fossil. Ooh, ah. So I'm going to mute my mic and pass it over to Lydia.
Hi everybody, I'm Lydia, and just wanted to check in. I'll check with, are we, everyone can hear me okay? My voice is not too loud or anything? But today I want to talk about North Dakota's state fossil. North Dakota's state fossil, in my humble opinion, is the greatest of all the state fossils. And I'll tell you why today. It's something to be proud of, I think, because North Dakota's state fossil, Teredo, is, or actually Teredo-bored petrified wood, is actually a combination of 3 different fossils. Everyone else has a state fossil that is just one fossil, but North Dakota's state fossil is 3 different fossils combined together into one wonderful package. So I'll start by showing you a piece of rock that has a sliced off side. It was cut with a saw, and this is what it looks on the outside. So those of you who are in North Dakota, if you ever are able to kind of see something like this, I'll show you the polished side here. So up close, you can see all of these little kind of tubes and holes and things like that. Different parts of the rock. Here's the rough face so that you know what you're looking for when you're actually going fossil hunting, which I hope you do. So you can see this is actually more like a bunch of like rough vertical tubes. From the side, you can see them really nicely. So we have 2 different polished sides. So this is your state fossil, and it, maybe you might not think it looks like much, but I'm going to tell you all the stuff that you need to know about this fossil, and why it's really important and really useful. So how is one state fossil a combination of 3 different fossils? Well, we're going to start off with the petrified wood part. So the state fossil, Teredo-bored petrified wood, starts off with the petrified wood part. So you can think of that as kind of like the substrate. It's like the dirt that the fossil is playing in, basically. So in this case, here's a piece of petrified wood. So here it is from the side. It's petrified, meaning it's like lithified, because all of the organic wood part of it has been replaced by a mineral, probably quartz. So in North Dakota, there's lots and lots and lots of petrified wood. And there's also stuff that looks like petrified wood, but it's not. So I first thought I'd show you this piece of petrified wood, but then show you a very cool fake piece of petrified wood. This is one of my favorite pieces in the North Dakota collection of specimens. This doesn't it look exactly like petrified wood? You pick this up and you totally think it was petrified wood, right? Someone was using this piece of petrified wood, it's not petrified wood, as a doorstop in their office here at North Dakota State University for decades before, I know, Becky Barnes is covering her face in horror because she knows this is not petrified wood. But you would think that, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is a tusk, right? This is a tusk, that's right. The vertebrate paleontologists are checking me here. So how would you know that this isn't petrified wood, even though it looks totally a lot like petrified wood? It has a nice curve to it. That's a good indicator. So, wood doesn't usually have a nice kind of bow to it. And it's like really like flaky too. I'm not going to flake any off of it, but but that's otherwise, if you were just looking at it like this, petrified wood wouldn't also have all of these like little spaces in it. It wouldn't have been fully petrified. And tusks are already made of a mineral, basically, so they wouldn't need to go through the whole petrification process. So this is not petrified wood, but our state fossil is petrified wood. So back to our petrified wood. So in kind of an aquatic system of some kind, wood pieces from nearby trees, before they were petrified, kind of wash around or sit on the beach or sit on like the side of a lake or something like that. And while they're there, organisms often use this kind of like hard, heavy wood structure as a material that they can live on. So that is exactly what happened to the petrified wood that became our state fossil of Teredo-bored petrified wood. So here is a piece of beech tree wood, basically. So see all these little holes in it? These were made by little organisms that were boring their way into this piece of wood so that it kind of became a stable home for them to live in. And for a lot of these organisms that might have been, used to living on the sand, if it's like a beach environment, waves are knocking sediment around, knocking sand around all the time. It's not a very stable place for organisms to live. So a relatively heavy piece of material that is pretty soft, actually, like wood is pretty soft. If they can bore their way into it, it's a good place for organisms to kind of live for the rest of their lives. And so some organisms, a lot of different organisms have adapted the ability to bore their way into relatively hard pieces of material like wood, but also here's a piece of stone from Oregon. It's pretty soft stone, like I can scratch it with my fingernail. And in it, there are a lot of little holes here. So after this is a mud rock, after the mud became a rock by being lithified or petrified, like petrified wood, then organisms started boring their way into it so that it acted as a substrate for them to live as well. And so I'll show you some examples of this. Okay, so this is the same rock, but with the shells of the organisms that were found in it still in there. So they're removable now, but they fit perfectly into the little holes that they're found in, just like that. So it's just like a cool, little puzzle piece, this one here. So I have left them exactly in the holes that they were found in. And basically what they do is they bore a hole in there when they're little baby clams, and that's what all of these are, like little clams. They have a special adaptation to allow themselves to kind of bore their way into some material when they're little. And then as they grow, they just kind of wiggle in place to make the hole bigger for them until the hole is exactly as big as the organism is. And what this means in a lot of cases, I'm going to show you this one here. So there's another one right there. You can barely see it. You only see the opening of the hole that organism is living in. They're completely trapped inside of the hole once they're there. So that's okay for them. They don't mind. They want to be in a kind of a stable substrate. And then all they're doing is drawing in water and eating all the stuff that's in the water and then breathing it right out again. So if they can stay in one place and just do that, taking in water, breathing it right out again, they're happy. They're happy as a clam. And that's exactly what these little clams were doing back in the day. So some of these organisms have these special adaptations for boring their way into hard materials. How do we know that they are able to do this? So I mentioned clams. Clams are really common fossils that you find in oceans and lakes and all kinds of different places. And clams have a lot of different shapes to them. You might not even know all the different types of shapes that clams can have, but the shape of a clam tells you almost everything you need to know about that organism's lifestyle, even if it was hundreds of millions of years ago. So I mentioned this clam that's able to kind of bore its way into a rock. And the way that we know that it did that is by the shape of the clam itself, even if you didn't find it completely embedded in petrified wood or in other rocks. So here's I brought some examples of clam fossils. So here's one that, maybe you've seen something like this. This is probably a freshwater clam. And the shape of it tells me that it is a burrowing clam. So it doesn't bore into a hard material, it burrows into the sediment itself, and then it lives there. So that the way that I know this is because it has kind of a moon shape to it. So it's not much, but you see this little crevice here. So the way that these clams work their way into the sediment, if you imagine that this is the top of the seafloor, then they kind of work this hard point, this pointy point into it, kind of work their way in, And they use this part of their shell as like a ratchet, as a way to like kind of crank their way around the sediment. So basically they kind of push their way in here, and then they rotate their body around one point and then push their way down again, rotate down, push their way down until they're inside of the sediment. And this is a pretty big clam. So it probably was a couple of inches below the sediment. I'll tell you another way that I know how deep it lived inside of the sediment. Once these clams, they have a little organism that lives inside. That's the clam animal that has, you know, two shells. If they're inside of the sediment, they're also trying to filter water that has their nutrients in it. So the way that they actually access the water, even if they're underground, is that they have a tube called a siphon that comes out here like this. And it sticks out of the sediment surface. So if the sediment is here, the siphon is able to penetrate through and to breathe water. And the interior of the shell, there's a couple of important features. There's this kind of splotch, this other splotch, and this is where the muscles of the shell attach to open and close the shell. But then there's also this indentation here. This is called the siphonal notch. And that's where the siphon, its breathing tube, would come out. And this one is like maybe like an inch long, so it's probably not a very long siphon, so it's not the deepest of the clam siphon. So the deeper this notch is, the deeper the clam burrowed into the sediment. So that's a way that we could, and that's basically because you had to have a bigger and longer siphon. So the clam would have been facing up like this with its siphon sticking out. And in some cases, there are clams like gooey ducks that have really long siphons, like literally a foot or two long. They're way underneath of the sand surface, and their siphonal notch will be like really long. So this is a good size one, but it's not like it's not super big. So this is, you can use the morphology or the shape of a clam to tell you about how that clam lived, even if it was millions and millions and millions of years ago. And I'll show you another one. This is a fossil one. So this is an old oyster. So this is it from the side. This is the top of it. And I know that the way that this organism lived was similar to modern oysters, because it has different types of valves. So the top one's really thick and round, and this one's flat, so that it would have a good attachment surface with whatever it was cemented to. That's a feature of most oysters. And here's one of my favorite types of clams. This is a scallop. And did you know that some scallops are able to swim? You might think of clams as being just like sitting on the seafloor, or like, you know, just not doing much. But a bunch of different types of scallop clams are actually able to clap their valves really fast so that they're able to swim through the water. Isn't that wild? You can look up YouTube videos of swimming clams and see exactly what I'm talking about. But not all scallops can swim, only some can. But we know which ones are able to swim, because if we look at the shape of the clam, see these little kind of ears here? They're called auricles. And actually this thing here, this is also called an auricle. So these are named after our own ears. But when these look the same on either side, that's that it was a swimming clam. So most scallops will have one really long pointy ear and one kind of more blunted one. So because they are not the same on either side, if those clams that had one really long ear were clapping their valves, they would kind of do this when they were swimming. But these clams, because it's the same on either side, when they clap their valves, they can go in one direction. So they can do directional swimming. So when we see this clam, which is not a super old clam, but I see that it has pretty similar ears. Compare this to fossil clams. So some of these, and most of these, you can't see, but right here are the auricles right there. those ones are mostly symmetrical, meaning they're the same on either side. So these were probably a big pile of swimming clams at some point. And these could be 65 million years old. They could be incredibly old fossils and old clams. And we would still know that these were swimming around in the Cretaceous oceans literally tens of millions of years ago, even though we might not even have we might not come today. Here's another type of clam. This is mussels. And these are around today, and they have these special threads. They're called, see that like hairy part? These little hairs are used to attach to something underneath of the sediment as like an anchor to hold the clam in place so that it's able to stay in one spot. And these are really strong. These are stronger than your hair. And they're able to stay in place in these anchors to stay on, so they don't go anywhere. So this is just kind of emphasize that a lot of some clams want to be able to move. Like scallops are able to swim, probably to escape predators. But a lot of clams just want to stay in one spot and drink water and filter out all the nutrients that are in water, like bits of algae and that. So different shapes of these clams. So this one is kind of like a teardrop shape. That usually means that it was attached to the seafloor using these kinds of weird little threads. Here, I'll kind of see how hairy they are. Aren't those neat? And then finally, I'll show you this one. This is from the Jurassic, so at least 100 million years ago. And I'm just showing it to you because they are not around today anymore, and they have a great name, which is, their genus name is Gryphea, and they're also called, colloquially among friends like us, they're called the devil's toenail, because they look like a gross toenail. So what did this clam do? What did this guy do? Well, we think that, even though it has this weird shape, we think that if this was the seafloor, they would have lived just underneath of the surface like this, so that they would have a little opening here. This is the second valve. Here's the first one, really long and weird. And then it had a little flat one just here. So it would open up like like a toilet lid. So they feel like it would just kind of open up just a little bit, and then filter in all the water and breathe it right back out again. So just underneath of the surface like that. And there's lots and lots of these clams all over the world in the oceans during the Jurassic, lots of toenails everywhere. So I think they're super neat. Finally, I want to show you this clam. So this guy here, it's called a Pholidomya. And this one here, it's a relative. And they have strong ridges on this end and this end. And they're often reinforced with extra strong minerals. And these are exactly the kinds of clams that are specially adapted to use these kind of ragged but really strong edges of their shells to wiggle back and forth and grind away a soft material like wood or a soft rock. And these are exactly the types of clams that we find inside of other rocks and pieces of petrified wood, are like the clam Teredo, which is what we get in our state fossil. So I started with the petrified wood. We told you about how petrified wood, it's mineralized, but before it gets mineralized, it's a soft material that if you have the right kinds of material in your shell, like those clams do, they're able to kind of just scratch, even though it's really tiny. So you find some little nook or cranny on the piece of wood and just start working their way there and making their little forever clam home. And we see this in rocks and wood, and it's special because that is exactly what's going on with our state fossil. So our first fossil was the wood itself in our state fossil. So the petrified wood is fossil number 1. Our second fossil is the animal that bored into the wood, which is a teredo clam. Sometimes teredo clams are called shipworms because they have like a long wormy body with just like a little clam at the end. A lot of people don't even notice the clam part and think that they kind of look like worms, but that's not a correct name. It's a misnomer they're not worms. They are little clams that, as little organisms, little baby clams, had worked their way into the wood to set up their homes. So each one of these tubes, in some cases you can see a little clam at the bottom of it. It's not super common to find that, but they're there. So clam is the second fossil. Now, what's the third fossil? You might be wondering, what's the third thing? The third thing is actually the burrow that's made by the organism. So this is a kind of fossil that a lot of people don't know about by name, but you definitely know about these kinds of fossils, maybe just didn't know that they had their own kind of special type of fossil name, and they're called trace fossils. So trace fossils are not the body of an organism or the shell of an organism, but the remains, the fossilized remains of their behavior. So I brought some examples of other types of trace fossils to show you. So here's a cute one. These are little paw prints from like some kind of like little, I don't know, mammal-like, oh wow, this is really old, mammal-like reptile tracks. Wow, so these are 270 million years old when some of the earliest mammals were kind of just showing up. These are, you can see that they have like little fingers there. So we can learn a little bit about the morphology or the shape of the animal that made these footprints just based on the footprint shape that they made, but we don't have the animal here itself. So this is an example of a trace fossil. Dinosaur footprints are trace fossils. These are trace fossils. I'll show you another one. Oh, I know trace fossil you probably know about. Who knows what a coprolite is? So here's a coprolite. Oh, here's the shape. I just love. I'm immature. What can I say? I got a couple of different coprolites here that are exactly, I see in the dino poo, but it could be any poo made by lots of different organisms. There's tons of different types of coprolites. One's made by shrimp, one's made by mammals, made by dinosaurs, exactly. And they're all mineralized remnants of the animal's behavior, that behavior being making poop. So it's a trace fossil, just like a footprint is, because it's not actually the organism, it's a fossilized remnant of what they did when they were alive. So coprolites are trace fossils. I just love that shape, fantastic shape. Looks like the emoji. And then here's one, I believe this is called Beaconites. So all trace fossils have a name, just like regular fossils do, often end with ites. So Beaconites was probably made by a little crab or something. It's working its way through the sediment, leaving behind little scratches as it went. So this is another type of trace fossil, and this might be all the way from Antarctica, and I think it's like 50 million years old. So it came from a really long way away, from a really long time ago, and it's not the crab itself that made the trace, but it's how that animal lived. So trace fossils are among my favorite fossils. They're not my favorite fossil, but they're among my absolute favorite fossils because I am always really interested in what those animals were actually doing. It's nice to see, you know, the actual, it's fun to find fossils, but unless you know what they were actually doing when they were alive, then it's just a shell. It's really great to know how that animal was actually living. And in some cases, it's hard to know exactly what they were doing, but when we find trace fossils, that tells us a lot more about how that organism was interacting with its environment. So here is a Beaconites, a trace fossil. Here is a clam that is covered in trace fossils. So these little holes that you see here were actually made by another organism. They were made by little sponges that, just like Teredo, that was looking for a stable place to live and found a piece of wood, some little sponges often find an old clamshell and think, oh, well, that's a nice stable home for me to live in. So they bore little holes into the surface of these clams. And so this clam is a fossil, but these holes are trace fossils. So what I'm holding in my hand is actually two fossils, right? The shell and the trace fossil itself. And then here, this is Arthrophycus, and I'm not sure how old this one is, but these are lots of little burrows that were made probably by some little worm thing. So you often don't find the animal. In fact, you usually don't find the animal that makes the trace associated with the rock itself. But you can, so that's, one kind of downside to studying trace fossils is we often don't know what the actual trace maker was, but you can tell that on the surface of the seafloor, so this would have been the top of the ocean, on the top of this, when the sediment was being deposited, the sand was being deposited before it turned into a rock, it was covered in squiggly little worms. It's kind of fun to think about. This brings us to our third kind of fossil that your state fossil is made out of. Each one of these little bore holes is a trace fossil. And they are stunning. They're so pretty. These are such pretty trace fossils. So your state fossil, Teredo-bored petrified wood, is comprised of the petrified wood itself, which is like the substrate, the house. Then the clam shell of the organism that was boring into it, and it's the borehole itself. So you have the wood, the shell, and the trace fossil that make up your state fossil of Teredo-bored petrified wood. And as I said, trace fossils have their own names. So the Teredo clam, or the shipworm, makes a trace fossil called Teredo-lites. When I showed you Beaconites, a lot of trace fossils have names that end in ites. That usually is a hint scientist that it's a trace fossil. Teredo-lites, so it's just Teredo plus an ites at the end, basically. Teredo-lites is the third trace. So 3 total. No other states have a 3 fossil state fossil except for us. So we've got 1, the Teredo, 2, the petrified wood, 3, the trace fossil. It's the best state fossil of them all. What can I say?
So our first question is, what had tusks?
Cool. I'm gonna ask you, because I always forget which one, if it's a mammoth or mastodon. I don't remember.
Just from that little chunk there, it's going to be really hard to tell if it's mammoth or mastodon because both had tusks. Yes.
I think that those are our options then, I guess. But somebody thought this was just a big piece of petrified wood, and they were using it to prop their door open for literally 25 years before a paleontologist, Alan Ashworth, he's a retired paleontologist from our department, happened to be chatting with them and asked them what they were doing with a tusk holding up open their door. They had no idea.
Okay, where can you find petrified wood?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, let's see. So where I live in Fargo, I don't think you're going to find any petrified wood for quite a while. And that's because I live in a river valley where there's just basically mud that's been piled up. And I don't think you find that many plant fossils here. But if you go out to closer to where, Becky and Clint and Jeff live, and south of there, I think you can find lots of pieces of petrified wood in the early Paleocene deposits, just Paleogene deposits.
Okay, can some clams be round?
Yes. There are a lot of, well, there's two ways for a clam to be round. You can look at a clam this perspective here, and there are clams that are like circular like this, but sometimes when you look at them from the side, they're really flat. But then there's also clams that are like inflated like softballs. And they have, and those two different shapes, if you're round on one side, but actually very flat, like your hand, versus being rounded like this, these types of animals will have very different ways of living in, you know, relative to where they live on the seafloor or the lake surface or wherever. If you're shaped like a softball and you're living on top of the sediment, any, you know, wave action, you'd be like rolling around like crazy. It wouldn't be a very, you know, it would be a tough way to live. So a lot of times when we see things that are more rounded, like this half of like this devil's toenail, this half of it was probably underneath of the sediment and then flat on top. So a really round kind of clam was probably one that lived underneath of the sediment surface, so that water currents and waves wouldn't bop it around a lot, because that will break your shell and it's hard to eat, which clams are doing like all the time. It's hard to eat when you're kind of being rolled around doing somersaults 24/7. So there are round clams, like very round clams, and they lived in a very different way than flat clams do.
Okay, what is the difference between vertebrate and invertebrate paleontology?
Ooh. Well, I study mostly invertebrates, which are, there's a lot of different kinds of invertebrates. Vertebrates include lots of animals like humans and cats and dinosaurs and fish. I also study fish teeth, and I know there was a video about this posted for the Thursday lecture. What's the difference between them is that I just study pretty much anything that doesn't have a backbone like vertebrates do. So that includes a lot of clams that I've shown you some of, but invertebrates are incredibly diverse. It includes all the worms, and there are a lot of different worms, y'all. There are a lot of different kinds of worms out there, and we don't know much about them at all because worms are usually soft and squishy and only leave behind trace fossils. So I love trace fossils because it tells you about like 25 different types of animals, like worms, different types of worms that don't usually leave a fossil record. But invertebrates also include a lot of different kinds of animals that live in the ocean that are really important and have been in the oceans for 500 million years, for like more than 500 million years. Include things like echinoderms, which are, you know, include things like sea urchins and starfish. Those are invertebrates. Lots of different kinds of animals that you might not be familiar with, like brachiopods and little microscopic things like bryozoans. So I like invertebrate paleontology because I think it really, by using invertebrate fossils, you can get a pretty good idea about what an entire ecosystem was like by looking at all the different types of organisms that made up that system. The other probably one difference between invertebrate paleontology and vertebrate paleontology, in general, invertebrates fossils are pretty abundant in sedimentary deposits. They often make up like a fair bit of the entire rock. So you can if you want to just find a lot of fossils, invertebrates are a great way to go. I actually brought some of my favorite fossils. My favorite fossils, for curious, are crinoids, which live in the oceans today, and they are shaped like this. So they have a stem. They're not plants, they're related. They're like starfish if starfish had a stem, or sea urchins if they had like a stem coming out of their face. So the face of these things is up here. They've got this long stem and these long arms that are things out of the water. You know, once they die, they usually fall into like, there's some stem, little bits of their arms. But exactly, sea lilies, you nailed it. And then, but when even those bits fall apart, they leave behind my favorite kinds of fossils. These are a whole bunch of crinoid stems. So these are little bits of crinoid stems that would have been stacked up. So they have a little hole in the middle, and there's them from the side. And my favorite thing about them is that when you find them, they look like big piles of Cheerios, but they're 350 million years old. So all of these are little bits of the stems of these organisms.
Is there such a thing as a petrified pearl?
Oh. You know, that's an interesting question. So pearls, let's see, I think I have an example. So pearls are made in the inside of a clam. All pearls are made this way. So, and the reason why they form, it's an adaptation for clams when they're breathing in water. So they draw in water and they filter through it looking for tiny bits of material for them to eat. But sometimes when you do this, some sand or some grit gets inside of the shell. And, you know, you might not think of it, but the inside of clam shells are very smooth. And that's because the animal is pushed against the side of it. If it was really rough and hard, you know, it might tear up the clam. Like, and you'd be like, it's the same way as when you get sand in your mouth. It doesn't feel good, right? It would feel the same way for a clam. So the way they deal with this, if they like, you know, it's like if you get like a piece of like something stuck in the upper, you're like, we're trying to get it out. You can't get it out. Clams have even, you know, they don't have a finger that like lets them like, you know, get something out of there. So sometimes they just have to live with it, but you know, that's not comfortable. You wouldn't want to live with a piece of sand in your mouth for the rest of your life, right? So the way they deal with a random grain of sediment that's rough around the edges, the way that they deal with this is they just start pressing a soft, smooth material against it, until rolling it around until it's just not sharp and jagged anymore. They coat it in layers of this soft material that is what pearls are made out of. And the material that pearls are made out of is called nacre. But weirdly enough, nacre is not a mineral. So I'm going to get a little sciencey here. I'm going to call it's an amorphous mineral, meaning that it's kind of like it doesn't have a set crystalline structure to it, which shells are made out of set crystalline structure called calcium carbonate. It's a mineral. But nacre made out of calcium carbonate, but it's it's a squished up version of it that doesn't have a set mineral structure. And for that reason, it doesn't turn into fossil very well, because it just kind of ends up getting dissolved. Good minerals are able to turn into fossils. Shells are really easy to turn into fossils. Interior layer of them, the nacreous layer, which I'll show you this mollusk again, and I'll hold it kind of up against the light. You might be able to see that it's shiny, it's pearly. And a lot of shells that you can find here in North Dakota, in the western part of the state, here's an Inoceramus. These are unbelievably well preserved, and we know this because they have their nacreous layer still there. So the inside of a clamshell, you have the shell, then there's this kind of special protective nacreous layer, which is made out of nacre, and that protects the organism from kind of the rough parts of the shell. So here's an Inoceramid, and I can't see it. Oh, it's kind of catching the light there. So there's a little pearly layer there. That's a very uncommon component of most shells. Technically, nacre, which makes pearls, will not mineralize. It's not a mineral itself exactly. It's more like glass, which is amorphous silica. And so it doesn't usually turn into a fossil very well. You can find it associated with fossils in some special cases, like what we have here in North Dakota.
We know of one example right now in North Dakota that there was a single fossil pearl found by our paleontologist emeritus, Dr. John Hoganson. He actually found a little pearl. So I know of one example.
So see, that's rare. That's so rare. I'm super excited to hear that because I've never heard of a fossilized pearl before. So that goes to tell you that it doesn't happen very commonly. Even if it is, you know, it's associated with a shell, it's hard, but they don't preserve very well just because of their mineral structure.
Our understanding is that it's on exhibit now at the University of Florida in Gainesville.
Ooh.
So cool. if you're in the area, check it out.
We're my Gainesville people.
Okay. Why is it called petrified wood? I thought petrified means scared.
I'm gonna make a guess here. Okay, so like I think maybe it's like because it's like frozen, you know, like when you're petrified. I'll make the jet. I'll do what, like when I think of Sony's petrified, I think And I'm like, you're frozen in place. That's your skin, you know, like you freeze. So maybe it refers to that. I'm not totally sure.
What is the oldest species of clam?
Oh, that's a great question. So clams have been in the oceans, and we know because of their clam shells. Clams have been in the oceans for at least 530 million years. So more than 500 million years. But they probably existed in the oceans before that, but without a shell. So organisms that lived right before that, like kind of about 540 million years ago, there are these soft and squishy organisms that mostly didn't have any shells at all. No animals did, except for a couple of little tube worms that one of my grad students studies. And this time period that these soft, squishy organisms lived in is called the Ediacaran period. And these were the first big, complex animals that lived in the oceans. And at some point, about 550 to 535 million years ago, a whole bunch of different groups of animals started growing shells all at once. Well, over the course of a couple, like 10 million years or so. And this is called the Cambrian explosion. So it's called that because we start to get a really good fossil record for animals because they started growing hard parts. Before that, though, you have these soft and squishy animals. We only know them from imprints in the seafloor. But we find them all over the world, and some of them look like plants, kind of like a frond. Some of them look like little round, kind of flat circles, but with like a crevice running down the center. And one of those is called Kimberella. And we think that that was one of the first mollusks, and that's what clams are. Clams are a type of mollusk. So at some point after that, they started growing one shell and then maybe a bunch, and some of them grew two. So you get your first snails, your first limpets and chitons and bivalves, which are what clams are. We have those as a fossil record after that, but they might have, the mollusks were probably around a little bit before that. But our first clams are clearly bivalve clams are from the Cambrian, so 540 million years ago.
Back to the trackway that you had held up with all the footprints. What is the name of the animal that made the tracks, or do you know, or does it have a sciencey name?
So one of the rules, if you are to study trace fossils, which you should, because trace fossils are awesome, is that you often don't technically know and kind of technically can't know the actual thing that made the tracks. Even if you find an animal, like think of a burrow. For example, one of my favorite land-based trace fossils is called Daemonellix, and it's sometimes called the devil's corkscrew. It was a giant like burrow, like it's huge. Maybe should I just pull up a picture of it? Okay, so look at this crazy thing. This is a giant burrow that is underground and in like a prairie type of environment. It would kind of, we think that an animal would have burrowed all the way down, and then where it actually lived was in one of these like side spaces. And we found animals in those side spaces in this area, in the bottom part. So that could be the animal that made that trace. But maybe it was an animal that took over that space after the animal that did live there moved out, right? So we don't 100% know. Now, there's a state park that has a lot of these trace fossils. I think it's in Nebraska, but it's on this fossil freeway, where you can see all these great continental vertebrate fossils and stuff. But you can see these things in the side of a cliff. And they've found animals that live them, and they've also matched that animal's claw shape and size to scratch marks that they found on the inside of the Daemonellix burrows. So in this case, you're like 99% sure that that's the animal that makes it. But trace fossil research says you're never 100% sure. But this particular specimen here, this type of footprint, this particular shape, has a trace fossil name of Calicnus. So that's the name of the trace fossil, not the name of the animal that makes it. They're separate names. This is another like thing about trace fossils. A lot of them end in ites, but ichnus is another common way to end the name of a trace fossil, and ichnus means trace. So the name of the animal that made this, we don't know. We think that it was some type of mammal-like reptile, but that's all we know.
Would ammonites eat clams?
Let's see. So ammonites, let me show one of these. So, okay. So here is a nice polish. This is not what an ammonite would look like when you pick it up. This one's been like hand polished by somebody so you can see the interior part of it. But you can see all of these lines that are kind of, you start with this would have been like the baby ammonite, and it kept adding shell material until it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And so here's where the mouth of the animal would have come out of. And then here is a kind of reconstruction of what this animal would have looked like. So it was a relative of a squid. It's another kind of cephalopod. They're actually also related to clams because they're both mollusks. And so the soft, squishy part of the animal does not get preserved usually, but their hard shell would have been preserved. And actually, one other indicator that this belongs to the mollusks, just like clams do, is that on the inside of North Dakota and Montana ammonites that you can find here, is that where they're excellently preserved, like that clam I showed you, you can find the nacreous layer. So all mollusks on the inside have this pearly layer that protects the animal from their shell. So there are different types of ammonites, and some of them were taller than me, like literally, and I'm over 5 feet tall, very tall, over 5 feet tall. So these things would have probably been predators. And just like squid, they were able to grasp their prey, and then their squid don't have teeth, but they have a beak. Isn't that weird? They have beaks on the inside right there. So they use their arms to grab and pull in and then, eat on that organism. So, a clam could have just been sitting there on the seafloor, and then this thing just kind of like attacks it and then, pulls open the part of the shell and eats the animal. Now, would this thing have been able to eat all the clams? No, because clams have certain adaptations that keep them from being picked up and eaten by predators. So I showed you some examples of good adaptations against predators. Something like this oyster that I showed you before, they would have been completely cemented to the surface of the seafloor. So this thing could have tried to eat this thing, but it wouldn't have been able to wrench it off the seafloor, right? So by cementing itself to some hard surface, that's one way that a clam could keep from being eaten by a predator. Another way that clams could avoid being eaten by predators is that this kind of predator swam through the ocean like this. By living underground, predator wouldn't even know that they were there. So a clam like this guy would have been kind of hidden beneath of the seafloor. Its orientation right. Would have been underneath of the seafloor like this. And this thing could have been, let me poke around, I don't know. It wouldn't even know that that thing was underground. And then let's see, one other example would be something like these mussels. These byssal threads that I showed you before, these hairs up there, they're strong enough that it could have resisted being pulled off by the predator. So certainly clams have been eaten by ammonites, but the ones that are adapted to avoid being eaten by ammonites sometimes weren't.
What is the biggest clam that you have found?
Let's see, the biggest clam that I've found has a great name. It's called Lopha montis. And I think are some Lopha still around today? I'm not sure. I can't remember. But the ones that I found, they're not like, I mean, to be honest, they're not giant. Oh, wait, no, they're not the biggest. I'll tell you about the Lopha first. So Lopha are like, the ones that I found are like the size of a peanut butter sandwich, I guess. And where the clamshell meets, so that kind of the ring around the outside, we call that the commissure, is really cool because it's zigzag shaped. So it had a really strong, it had really strong buttresses, or like, you know, these raised ridges, so that while this clam just has kind of like a wiggly surface, Lophas were like jagged zigzags. And why they had that particular zigzag look to the opening of their shell was because it was harder for grains of sand to work their way in between that kind of zigzag shape. So they could open their valves just a little bit and bring in water without bringing in a lot of sand or silt. So, you know, it's an adaptation for living in a silty, sandy environment where there was a lot of that in the water. The biggest clam, I just remembered, the biggest clam that I've ever seen in person is a true mystery clam. It's called a Wallowa conchidae, and conch means clam. Conchidae is just like a, you know, saying it's a type of a group of clams. And then Wallowa, which is at the front part, is the mountain range where it's found from. So the Wallowa conchidae are the weirdest clams I have ever seen in my life, and we don't totally know what these clams were doing. And I showed you all those clam shapes, right? And said, like, this clam means it's a swimmer, this clam means it's a burrower. This clam is shaped like if you took a giant lily pad, right? Like that is on the surface of like a lake, and then a football into the middle of it. That's the shape of a Wallowa conchidae. They look, and from the side, some of them are over a meter across. And they're, I think that maybe they lived kind of like a lily pad, but on the surface of the sediment, with the clam living like this. And I'll show one in cross section. They are so weird. So from the side, it looked like this. And they're like that big. And where I've seen them, you'll actually see these parts overlapping with each other. So they might have been battling for space, just like lily pads do, why lily pads get really big. And the leading theory for what these things were doing is that they had these little crevices on the inside of their shell where algae would live and produce energy for the clam, so that these were wide platforms, not so the clam could photosynthesize, but so the algae living in its tissues could. So I'll show, yeah, someone asked if I could pull up a picture. Why don't I pull up a quick pic? This is exactly where I saw, this is exactly the outcropping of rock where I saw them. So see, there's this bit, there's the football shape and the weird lily pad wings coming off the side. So these are from the Triassic period, meaning they're, you know, over 230 million years old. And this specific reconstruction of what we think that they looked like. So you can only see them from the side, but there's the big football shape and a big lily pad in the middle. I love these clams, and they're the biggest ones I've seen, and they are among the weirdest ones I've seen. So those are the Wallowa conchidae, and I found those, I've seen those in Oregon, which is where that mountain range is.
You already covered this one, but we'll do it again just briefly. What is your favorite fossil?
My favorite fossil are the crinoids. They're so neat. They've been around for over 500 million years. They started off just as kind of being a simple filter feeder where they just kind of have their long stem, filter things out of the ocean. But in the time period that I work in, which is the Triassic period, when we see a whole bunch of neat adaptations showing up in clams, in predators at this time that were adapting to eat clams using, you can tell that from their tooth shapes, which you should watch the video that was posted yesterday. You can learn about how tooth morphology, tooth shape tells you about what vertebrates were eating. I study little teeth of the fish at this time as well to see how they relate to their prey, like clams and stuff. But the echinoderms, and the crinoids specifically during that time period, also start showing really weird adaptations. So going from just sitting on the seafloor to being able to swim, like a video that I showed you, it's just crazy. So they started developing all these neat adaptations, and I think that they might have been related to avoiding predators, but that's kind of an ongoing question. But they're really cool fossils. I love that they look like Cheerios, and they're just really cool animals that can do really cool things.
All right, we have a specific question. It says they live near Grand Forks and they found clamshell imprints. But how is this possible since they're in the Lake Agassiz area?
Well, there's not, so there's a lot of the most like fossil producing invertebrates mainly live in oceans. So like brachiopods and crinoids and a lot of these things live in the oceans. But there's some invertebrates that have adapted to live in non-ocean water, lake water. So that includes things like snails and clams. So it could be that the clams were freshwater clams. And there are a lot of clams that live in rivers and lakes. As far as I know, of the mollusks, I think snails are the only ones that have figured out a way to live outside of water completely. They still need water, obviously, but they don't have to live inside of water. So your clams are probably freshwater clams.
Okay, and then this one's a combination of a couple of questions in here. Basically, like, what was your educational path to your career? And like, where did you go to college? What did you do?
So I went to Temple University in Philadelphia for not a paleontology or geology field. I went there for anthropology. So I learned about how adaptations work, and I learned about how, you can use remains of organisms to tell you about major changes on the planet. But at that point, I was studying mostly humans. And then for going to grad school, I was interested in mass extinctions and things like that. So I started applying to geology departments because fossils are rocks. And that means that, a lot of paleontology is related to geology questions, geology plus biology. And is basically what you get for paleontology. So I studied fossils, and I studied earth sciences for my PhD, and I learned all about how to find fossils and what the sediments that you find around them mean. And then I got my job here, so now I'm a paleontologist.
Okay, and with that is wrapping up the end of the questions. So I want to thank you for taking your time to talk with us and to talk to all the families that are watching currently.
Of course.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, and definitely thanks to all the families for coming. And I hope at some point we can all come and visit the NDSU fossil collections, and I look forward to meeting all of you in the future.
So thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.